Honored to have you here this evening, Dr. Taylor. How are you?
Thank you. I'm really, really excited about the opportunity to speak about something that I think is pretty interesting to this group. So thank you so much for asking me.
You're welcome. Can I just have everybody pop into the chat box who you are, parent, caregiver, teacher? We've got a solid attendance this evening, so you can go ahead whenever you're ready, Dr. Taylor.
Great. And these things are always really challenging to do via Zoom, unfortunately. So probably what we're going to do is hold questions to the end, but I really have no end time. And so I'm happy to kind of stay for as long as people need me to stay. So I'd say hold questions till the end or stick questions in the chat box and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, whichever you prefer. Some
Great.
people don't
We've got a
want to
good
ask.
we've got a good mix. We've got a lot of parents, we've got mental health clinicians, we've got some teachers here as well. It's a good mix of people.
Excellent. And again, I'm happy to kind of do further versions of this talk or to kind of do other talks getting into more detail on specific areas if people are interested at a later date. Just to kind of get us started in terms of some of the data. So if we think about it, we have 100 trillion different microbes in and on us. And so that's actually more kind of microbes, bacteria than there are stars in the Milky Way. So it's amazing kind of when we think about it. And in terms of just genetic material, there's 150 to 1 in terms of genes in your microbiome, how much they outnumber genes in our own genetic um, material. So it also makes you wonder, sometimes like who's running the show? Are we just kind of basically walking around as a vector to at the mercy of our genetic material, which is really fascinating. And people have also been able to kind of track back almost 90% of all illnesses to different changes in the microbiome. And the good thing about that is the microbiome, when we talk about microbiome, most of it is actually in your GI system. And so it's actually something that we really can access in order to manipulate. And so that for me is pretty exciting because it may be, if that's involved in causing disease, and maybe that it's involved or provides us with a unique opportunity to help treat disease too. And some diseases that perhaps at first glance people might not intuitively link to your gut microbiome, which include, of course, diseases like psychiatric ones. And so basically, when we think about kind of the role of the gut microbiome and its link to mental illness, it's kind of at first pass pretty simple. So if people are healthy and kind of are well from a CNS perspective, they often have healthy gut bacteria at the same time. And then the corollary is also true that if there's periods of stress, disease, you get alterations in your gut microbiome that results in abnormal GI function. And more, we're starting to understand that it actually results in abnormal brain function as well. And, we thought this may sound like science fiction to a lot of people and kind of, you know, I apologize for the dog background. Where are we heading with some of this stuff? But this is actually not new science or not a new idea, I suppose. The science around being able to understand what's going on is new, which is why I think this area is becoming more and more to the forefront again. But if you can see this slide in front of us, this is from the Battle Creek Sanatorium, and it was basically an information booklet, much like AHS puts out information booklets. This was one for the spa that was written in 1918, and it talked about the concept of autointoxication or intestinal toxemia. And what they were referring to is a theory that there were toxins produced by your GI system that resulted in different, what we now know as mental illness. They would have called it kind of stress or burnout, or melancholia was the term. And so what they would do is they would run different retreats and spas to treat this stress and burnout. And how they would treat it would be to get everyone to eat a bland diet. And the thought was that by changing the diet that people ate, this would actually have a beneficial impact kind of on their mood and their ability to regulate their stress level. Of course, when you change your diet, what you're actually changing is the bacteria in your GI system as well. And you can see that this is something that was actually produced or run by J.H. Kellogg. Many of us, ate breakfast cereal by this family this morning, and that's actually where bran flakes and all of these other things actually came from. It came from this initial focus on eating these specific bland foods in order to change your GI system and to improve your ability to cope with stress. Of course, as unfortunately sometimes happens in different treatments, that things were taken a bit too far. And initially, people started to understand that if you felt like different foods could improve your mood by changing up your GI system, that they could actually start to consume other things. And one of the things that people proposed was consuming lactic acid producing bacteria, which is probably the first really kind of evidence of a probiotic. But unfortunately, after that, people sort of thought, okay, if we can really, if changing your GI system is a treatment for kind of stress and burnout and other things, what else can we do? And so they moved into what was known as psychosurgeries, which were basically removing parts of the GI system in order to treat major mental illness like schizophrenia. And so, as one can imagine, surgeries in the early 1900s in which part of the colon was removed in individuals with major mental illness who didn't actually really want that surgery, that the outcomes were not good. And at the same time, the whole, what's kind of still known of today is sort of the monoamine theory of mental illness. And so that's kind of focused on neurotransmitters and treatments that impact neurotransmitters were first getting going. And the first psychiatric medications, chlorpromazine being the first one, was developed. And so people moved away from this whole area of kind of the microbiome and the gut-brain link. But of course, nothing's old or nothing new under the sun. And what goes around comes around. We're back again to focusing on the gut microbiome, in part because now we have better tools and a better understanding about how these areas might be linked. And so just kind of as an overview, there's actually a number of ways in which your GI system and your brain are linked, one of which is the neurotransmitter production that actually was the focus of, and still is a focus of, most modern day psychiatric medications to increase or decrease different neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are things like serotonin or dopamine. But we know that many neurotransmitters are actually produced not just in the brain but in your gut, and that the bacteria in your gut actually produce or are involved in the metabolism of the same neurotransmitters that drugs like Prozac, for example, are designed to increase. And so there's increasing evidence that those neurotransmitters can actually have an impact. We know that cortisol and inflammation are a big link. And so cortisol is your stress hormone. When you walk out of your house today and you see a bear that seems to have wandered out of the wilderness, you're going to get a cortisol surge. You're supposed to get a cortisol surge. It enables us to make decisions to kind of stay and play dead and hope the bear walks away, or to run away from the bear. What seems to happen in individuals who have illnesses like depression, for example, the cortisol surge is too high, or it just doesn't kind of peak and go back down again. And so there's this increase in cortisol. And so we now know that when cortisol is produced as in conjunction with the impacts of cortisol on the brain, cortisol also actually impacts things like permeability of your GI system. And when people talk about leaky gut, basically it makes your GI system slightly more permeable. And so things like bacteria, certain bacteria that are in your GI system leak out. And what that does is it causes an inflammatory response. Many of the antidepressants that are currently kind of on the market and many that are in development are actually thought to work via, in part, a anti-inflammatory mechanism. They're designed to impact inflammation. And so this cortisol, which is your stress hormone, causing different bacteria to leak out, causes this same inflammation that is associated with illnesses like depression. So it may be that this is part of where this inflammation is coming from. We also have this really interesting thing called short chain fatty acids. And so short chain fatty acids are the normal products that are produced when healthy bacteria in your GI system metabolize different fibrous type foods. And so they break down these foods and they produce things like short chain fatty acids. These short chain fatty acids have a direct impact on a lot of brain functions. They're involved in cognition, they're involved in just overall neuronal growth. And so if you have bacteria that decrease short chain fatty acid production, for example, you have too much of that. The theory being that that might actually predispose you to be vulnerable to some of these mental illnesses because you don't have enough of the good short chain fatty acid production as another person might have. We also have this really fascinating connection via your GI system in your brain that's direct, called your vagus nerve. And so it connects the two directly. Your vagus nerve is involved in a number of things. One of the things that part of the vagus was involved in is acid production in the stomach. And so we started to understand the role that the vagus had in mental illness when, as an early treatment for peptic ulcer disease, people would do something called a vagotomy where they cut the vagus nerve because that would decrease acid production in the stomach. People would get less ulcer symptoms. But the other thing that happened when the vagus nerve got cut was that people suddenly started to develop more psychiatric illnesses. And so it seemed like cutting off that connection between your GI system and your brain led to an increase in the development of different psychiatric presentations, indicating that that connection is really important for just overall mental illness. But I think the most kind of really interesting thing about all of this comes from some of these really fascinating animal studies. And certainly that work has really informed a lot of the stuff that I'm doing in my research right now, because my research focuses on humans entirely. But some of the animal stuff has really paved the way. And so the most interesting, I think, of all the animal work were studies where people took bacteria from humans. So it's human stool that they used from individuals who had different psychiatric illnesses. So stool from individuals with anxiety, stool from individuals with OCD, stool from individuals with depression, even autism. And they would transplant this stool into germ-free mice. So mice that don't have their own innate kind of bacteria. And what would happen is that in the mice receiving this stool, they would start exhibiting the symptoms of the illness that the individual had. And so mice that received stool from individuals with depression would start exhibiting what we would call depressive-like behaviors. And so they would sleep too much, they would not want to socialize, they would become, their appetite would diminish, they wouldn't want to go out and be social. Stool from individuals with autism the mice would actually start to display unusual social interactions that were different than the way they had been previously. And so, I think that this is fascinating for a couple of reasons. One of which is that it actually showed that you could transfer symptoms of mental illness, like there was a vector for it. And, it wasn't something that kind of just happened, that it could be caused, which is pretty far-fetched in terms of our understanding of how mental illness develops. But it also indicates if you can cause mental illness symptoms this way, maybe you can treat mental illness symptoms this way as well, which has really been something that I've been more and more interested in looking at. And so I'm going to go over just some of the evidence that we now know about, kind of linking these two types of presentations, both kind of your gut microbiome and the mood symptoms. And I've done my best to hopefully kind of make it be something that, is of interest to non-microbiome scientists, but feel free to ask me some questions. And so just to give you a sense, the very first thing we want to look at is to know, is the gut microbiome different if you have mental illness or not? And the answer to that is resoundingly yes. The trick is to understand exactly how it's different, and that's been a focus of more and more work. But certainly there has been a number of studies that have identified a significant difference between the gut microbiome in individuals who have depression and versus individuals who don't have depression. It's also been very different between individuals whom are depressed and on treatment and individuals whom are depressed and not on treatment. But the fact that there's a difference between the groups is no longer up for debate. We know that they're different. And I did some work really trying to look at what is the role of medication in terms of this difference. Does your gut microbiome change if you have depression and then you get treatment for that depression? Does that actually make a difference? And we were really interested in kind of individuals who had depression who weren't on treatment and then trying to follow them after they started treatment. And what we thought was that, the addition of an antidepressant was going to really change the gut microbiome. And you don't have to kind of understand lots of crazy statistics and graphs and such for me to explain that. If you think that there's no differences between kind of the three different colors, the black, the red, and the blue, that's because there's not. And we were pretty disappointed and pretty surprised when we started this work that there was no difference in what the gut microbiome looked like in individuals with depression before they got treatment and after, over the course of 6 months of treatment. It didn't really change. And we were really surprised at that. But then we decided to kind of take a step back and to really look at our data. And we were fortunate in that in our study, and we know that about 50% of people at least don't respond to current antidepressant treatments. They actually don't work for a lot of people. And we saw the same in our study, that a lot of, some people got really well, other people didn't get well at all. And what we found is that if we actually broke them apart and looked at the people that responded and the people that didn't respond, we actually found significant differences. And so there was something about being a responder to treatment that impacted changes in the gut microbiome. And so if people got well, their gut microbiome changed. If they didn't get well, the gut microbiome didn't change. And so it wasn't just an impact of, taking a medication and it changing your gut microbiome. There seemed to be some sort of treatment effect. And so what we don't know is if people got well because their gut microbiome changed, or if their gut microbiome changed because they got well. And of course, that's really important if we're going to try to think about cause and effect and targeting treatments. But we do know that the microbiome and people getting well were linked, which was pretty exciting for us. We then found the same thing, and again, basically these graphs are to show you that there's no difference in the populations we looked at. So we looked at individuals who had bipolar depression and who received a new treatment for that illness, which was actually an anti-inflammatory drug. And so, the people leading this study were really hoping to show that this anti-inflammatory drug was going to have a real impact on these depressive symptoms. And so we kind of piggybacked some research onto that study saying, okay, we want to look at if your microbiome changes when people get well. And again, the same thing happened. Unfortunately, there was no response in terms of people getting well. So this treatment didn't work for bipolar depression. And when the treatment didn't work, there was no change in the gut microbiome, which again is pretty exciting and wasn't what people predicted. They just assumed that your gut microbiome was going to change when you took a drug, and it doesn't. It only changes if people respond to the treatment. When we look at just the science in individuals who have bipolar disorder, there have been more and more groups now looking at the differences in the gut microbiome between individuals with bipolar disorder and healthy controls. And what they found is that there seems to be a decrease. And so operational taxonomic units, or OTU, basically just refers to the number of different bacteria that you have. And for pretty much every illness, we feel that you need to have a lot of diversity. And so kind of the more diverse the population, it's basically like you have a really healthy garden and you got a lot of flowers growing in it. And when people get unwell, they're just the variety of different bacteria that they have decreases. And that's been shown in a lot of illnesses for which we know the gut microbiome is linked. And so we see the same thing in mental illness. And so we look at individuals with bipolar disorder, their gut bacteria is much less diverse than individuals who don't have mental illness. And then this was a study that just looked at people who'd been sick for a long time, and these dots just basically refer to the number of different bacterial species present and what you can see. And so this was done in individuals with bipolar disorder, and you can see that the longer people were sick, and so this is along the bottom, it talks about things in months. So the longer people were sick, the less diverse their gut bacteria were. So again, we know that there seems to be some sort of connection where decreased bacterial diversity is something that occurs as people are sicker and as people are sicker longer. And that's interesting because it gives us something to focus on when we're thinking about, okay, how can we try to use this information in terms of developing a treatment. Interestingly, if we think about specific bacteria, so there was one particular bacteria called Fecalobacterium, which was much more abundant in HC. HC stands for healthy control, so people who weren't sick when compared with people with bipolar disorder. And Fecalobacterium is actually a bacteria that is anti-inflammatory, and so it helps decrease inflammation. And so it was more pronounced in individuals who are unwell. And it's also linked to short chain fatty acid production. And so again, the less of this bacteria you have, the less good short chain fatty acids there are going to be available to kind of help keep your brain strong and healthy. They also found that this one phylum called Actinobacteria was significantly more abundant in individuals with bipolar disorder. One of the things that this phylum is involved in is in things like cholesterol production. And we know that a number of the psychiatric medications seem to cause increases in things like glucose level and cholesterol and such. And that's a reason that a lot of people can't take some of the psychiatric illnesses. And so psychiatric medications for their illnesses. And so again, it starts to raise a lot of interesting questions about, are there actually specific bacteria that are actually kind of ramping up this activity of certain medications to cause weight gain and to cause these other things. And perhaps if we looked at trying to moderate the effect of some of these bacteria, could we help minimize some of these side effects? And so for me, it's, it really, I think is a positive thing the more that we understand. This is one of the few studies actually looking at an intervention. And so this study looked at individuals who had bipolar depression or had mania in bipolar disorder who are admitted to hospital. And so they looked at 66 people who were in hospital. And once they were discharged, they randomized them to either a placebo, which basically is sugar pill, or a probiotic. And we're going to talk about probiotics a little bit later. But they gave them this probiotic or the placebo. And what they found was that in the individuals who received the probiotic, they were much less likely to be rehospitalized. So they stayed out of hospital. If they did go back into hospital, the length of time that they stayed in hospital was significantly shorter. So they were less sick and they were able to get well quicker. Again, it starts to open up potential opportunities for us to look at different therapies that target the gut microbiome as being potentially appropriate for individuals who have mental illness as well. And people have kind of worked with that and have tried to translate some of this stuff into therapies. And I think one of the studies that actually really springboarded this was a study looking at fecal transplant in individuals with autism. And so individuals who have the diagnosis of autism, oftentimes, certainly not always, but sometimes, or more often than not, also have GI symptoms as well. And it's pretty common to experience GI symptoms. And so this group looked at a fecal transplant to treat the GI symptoms of autism. But as sort of a secondary measure, they were also really interested in just kind of some of the psychological and behavioral symptoms of autism as well. And I don't particularly like the nomenclature used around, mild symptoms or normal, but I have to take it from the paper. This is the way that they categorized individuals. And so what they found was that even over the course of 2 years, that the group that received fecal transplant had a significant reduction in terms of the GI symptoms. And that's gonna in graph A. But I think the thing that was actually much more fascinating to people is depicted in graph B, is that the number of individuals in the study who actually met clinical diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder decreased over the course of treatment and over the course of study follow-up. And so that was not something that people were expecting. And I'd say they were pretty flabbergasted by these results. Now, there's a lot of things to kind of be aware of in this study. First of all, it was small. It was only 11 people in it, and it was open label. So that meant everybody received fecal transplant. They knew they were getting fecal transplant. So sometimes, people just get excited about the fact that they're getting a new treatment, and they report that they're getting better because they're getting attention. They're seen by the study coordinator. They're seen by the psychiatrist. That gives them more therapy, and so maybe that's what's happening to cause people to feel better. But I think the study investigators felt that the fact that the difference lasted for 2 years, that there was something else going on. And so there's currently a much larger version of this study now happening in the US, and it's being done as a randomized control trial. So half the people are getting actual fecal transplant, half the people are not, and they're hoping to be able to show that there's a real difference of fecal transplant on these symptoms. But again, I think it's provocative, and I feel like maybe it gives us some hope in areas in which the treatments that we currently have aren't as good as we'd like them to be, for sure. Other illnesses that perhaps again seem a little bit unusual if we're thinking about the gut-brain connection. People have looked at the microbiome in individuals with ADHD, and they found that very different microbiome in individuals who have a diagnosis of attention deficit disorder as compared to individuals who don't. And that one of the things that they found was that there was an increase in bifidobacterium in individuals with ADHD. And this is a bacterium that's associated with enhanced production of phenylalanine, which is something that is used to produce dopamine. So dopamine is really important in kind of reward seeking. It's kind of motivating. It kind of makes us kind of get up and do things. But what they found in this group is that they kind of had too much of it. They wanted to get up and do a lot of things at the same time. And that actually makes sense if you think about it, kind of mapped onto some of the symptoms that we see in ADHD group. We also know that there's been some research to show that dietary interventions in this population can actually be helpful. So again, more evidence to show a gut microbiome link to psychiatric illness. they also looked at different mouse studies, and what they found was that, you know, when you did the colonization studies, they took stool from individuals with ADHD and they gave it to these germ-free mice, that they started to produce very unusual behavior in these open field tests. And so the way that we look at these open field tests, and I try to put in a bit of a picture, is that we actually monitor the amount of time that these mice, you know, spend in different areas of a particular maze. And you know, when they're particularly kind of adventurous, they spend a lot of time in the center. When they're anxious, they spend much more time around kind of the security of the borders. And they found that these mice were exhibiting behaviors that show that they kind of were a lot more anxious. They didn't want to be in the center. They wanted to be in near the sides. And they also did kind of MRI studies on these mice after they received these fecal transplants of ADHD stool, and they showed that a lot of the same types of things that we find looking at the brains of individuals, humans who have ADHD, they were able to cause to happen in these mice. And so again, just receiving the gut microbiome from individuals with ADHD seemed to cause brain changes in these mice, again, indicating a very strong link. But at the end of the day, you know, the challenge is trying to make this actually work and benefit people. And so there's been a whole field of treatments that are kind of rose up around, you know, what is becoming more known as psychobiotics. And so psychobiotics refers sort of a play on the term, you know, psychological medicines or antibiotics. So psychobiotics is a term used for any treatment that basically is bacterial based, that has been shown that people hope is gonna have a beneficial impact on mood. And so, you know, there is now psychobiotic treatments looking at mental health diagnoses like depression, anxiety, neurodegenerative disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, Tourette's, and even other symptoms like insomnia, which is often a symptom associated with kind of all of the above, and just try to see how the different treatments can be of benefit. Part of the challenge is that there's a lot of ways in which we can impact your gut microbiome. You know, many of you are probably familiar with the term probiotics, but there's actually a whole host of different types of biotics, I guess, for want of a better word. So probiotics, which, you know, many people take, and refers to live bacteria or yeast that are good for you, and especially for your digestive system. But we also have the prebiotics, which are compounds in foods. So, you know, different foods include things that can induce the growth or activity of beneficial microorganisms such as bacteria or fungi. So they're not actually pills that you take, they're actually in food. Then we have postbiotics, which are soluble factors such as the products or the metabolic byproducts that are secreted by live bacteria or released after the bacteria breaks down. And so it's actually basically bacterial byproducts. We have symbiotics, which are food ingredients or dietary supplements that combine, you know, both the probiotics and prebiotics together. Then we have the parabiotics, which are non-viable, so they're not living microbial cells or cell extracts. And then we have fermented foods, which are, you know, some people call them the superfoods, which are foods or beverages that have undergone controlled microbial growth and fermentation. So certain types of sauerkraut and other type foods that really seem to improve kind of your ability to, or kind of make your gut bacteria particularly happy. And so we, you know, we have all of those things. And so if we're going to think about, because people often ask, you know, kind of general advice around kind of what do I do about probiotics? And so This is taken from the literature, so I'm trying to share with you kind of the most up-to-date information around that. So I think that, there's no magic probiotic. There are many that are available to buy. The thing to remember is the area is unregulated, and many probiotics on the market haven't been rigorously tested. And so make sure you buy things from sources that you trust. There's certainly lots of brands that people are familiar with, like Jameson's and others, that I would try to stick to. If you're looking at probiotics, the probiotics should give information on the genus, which refers to the kind of the group of bacteria, as well as the species and the strain. And so kind of think about it, it's like it's going to tell you the continent, it's going to tell you the country, it's going to tell you the province, and hopefully it's going to tell you the city. It's going to give you a lot of information. And that's, this is important because one particular species or strain of bifidobacterium, for example, or lactobacillus might be effective for mood and anxiety, but another may not. And you may buy one bifidobacterium probiotic and you find that it's helpful, and then you go back and you buy another and it's not. And it may be because they have different bacteria subgroups in them. And so make sure that you kind of look at what you're taking and stay consistent. The product should give you information on the number of live bacteria or the colony forming units, or it'll often say CFU on the bottle. And we don't know kind of which dose is the right dose, but most of the research done on probiotics as psychobiotics have used products that contain at least 1 billion, which is 1 times 10 to the 9 CFUs a day. And so it'll have that information on the bottle. And if you're really interested in trying to improve your gut microbiome, you don't necessarily want to take a probiotic. There are other alternatives to increase your intake of fermented foods. Some of the things that people talk about is kombucha, sauerkraut, so on. There's a whole list of foods on the internet that you could just Google that contain these live bacterial cultures. And you can also take prebiotics that are going to encourage that type of growth. And prebiotics are found naturally in different foods, such as leeks or asparagus, onions, garlic, bananas. There's a whole host of them. And so, as long as you eat pretty healthy, I think that for most of us, we're going to, unless we're predisposed to certain illnesses, we're going to have a pretty healthy microbiome. I think it's also really important to know that while there's some evidence to say that certain lactobacillus and bifidobacterium probiotics, and these are pretty much what you're going to find in most of the commercially available probiotic pills that you buy, may be helpful for improving mood. This is really in those, it works better if people have mild, low mood and other symptoms of depression. And we also know that probiotics seem to be less beneficial for mood in individuals over the age of 65. And so if you're looking for something in someone who's above that age, this may be not something that's going to be that helpful. Now, the other area of research that's becoming kind of more popular, I suppose, or kind of more mainstream, is something that is a more direct target to your gut microbiome. And part of the issue with many of the probiotics is that they're actually broken down in your stomach, and they are designed, they don't colonize. And so they're not actually going to long-term change your gut microbiome, whereas things like fecal microbial transplant are actually designed to change the bacteria in your GI system. And work in this area started when people started using fecal transplant studies to treat C. diff infections, and fecal transplant for Clostridium difficile, which is often hospital-acquired infections, 84% to 90% successful with just one treatment. And so people became really excited about that, and then began to explore, much as we saw in the autism study, if this is something that maybe we can use to impact other areas or other types of illnesses as well. There's lots of things to remember about this whole area. One of the main ones is, sounds a little bit science fiction, but like the whole concept of fecal transplant is to take stool from somebody who's very healthy and give it to somebody who has a specific illness. And in this case, a psychiatric illness, because with the goal being to change the behavioral symptoms, then the opposite is also true. That if you take stool from somebody who has a particular illness, perhaps if you give it to another person, you're going to increase their vulnerability towards developing that illness. And so, if we take stool from somebody who has schizophrenia, are we increasing someone's risk of developing that illness down the road? And so, as a consequence, it's really important that these types of treatments be done in places that are regulated. There's some examples of people kind of doing this themselves at home, people going to organizations to purchase this type of treatment. These organizations are not necessarily as regulated, and bad things have happened. So it's really important, just like you wouldn't take, nobody would take a blood transfusion without knowing kind of the source of the blood and understanding that it was from a place that was very safe. You have to kind of use the same types of thought processes, I think, with getting fecal transplant. And we have started to do fecal transplant studies for the treatment of depression. And one of the very interesting things that we found is that it really seems to be helpful for certain mental illnesses. And so this is a graph showing fecal transplant for the treatment of bipolar depression, so the depressed phase of bipolar disorder or manic depression. And this is actually an illness that's notoriously difficult to treat, especially the depression part. And what this graph shows is, so the yellow line in the middle, that refers to a MADRS score, or Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, which is a scale used to measure symptoms of depression, of 7. So anything 7 or lower is considered to be, you're considered to have a normal mood. And so you can see that in the case of our study, that individuals were quite unwell when they started the study. And so they had a MADRS score of almost 25. But over the course of 6 months, they became progressively better, which is actually not something that's seen with any of our current antidepressant trial treatments in this illness. And so these results have resulted in a remission rate of 84%, which the most of the medications to treat this type of illness on the market do not have remission rates that high. Now, this was our interim analysis. We just are finishing the study actually in a couple weeks, so at the end of September, and then we'll be able to look at the whole spectrum of results, and maybe it'll have significantly changed and it won't look as good as sort of our midpoint did, but we're pretty optimistic that there seems to be a signal here indicating that manipulation of your gut microbiome can actually be really beneficial in individuals with mental illness. So we're pretty excited about it, and so much so that we've started another couple studies, which fortunately are happening here at UFC right now. And so one of the studies is another fecal transplant study looking at individuals this time who have unipolar depression, which basically just straightforward depression. And so again, we're looking at fecal transplant, hoping we're going to see similar results. Some of the good things is that the bipolar depression study was fecal transplant via colonoscopy. And so we're asking individuals with depression who didn't need a colonoscopy to sign up for one. And you would think that that would have been a hard sell, but it actually really was not. And I think that what we're seeing more and more is that individuals experiencing these symptoms, actually, this makes sense to them. The fact that we're trying to investigate a treatment that targets their GI system, because they feel that their mood symptoms and their GI symptoms are very much linked. And so we're looking now at, fortunately, no longer colonoscopy, but actually looking at fecal transplant pills. And so people can take it in a pill form. So it's much easier to kind of implement and to kind of scale out to people. I know a lot of people kind of on this call right now work or are interested in young people. Unfortunately, this is limited to people 18 and over for now. We're trying to expand it into a younger group because I think that it actually might be quite beneficial, we hope. But if you think that you might be interested in this study or hearing a little bit more about this study, the email to use to contact us is FMT, so fecal microbial transplant, FMT MDD, which stands for major depressive disorder. So FMT MDD study at ucalgary.ca. And if people can't remember that or want to kind of just chat with me a little bit more about it, you can also send me an email for sure. And I'm happy to provide information. But simply emailing that group, they'll let you know about kind of all of the different parts involved in the study, who's eligible, who's not, and all of those things. The other thing that we're doing right now is running a research biobank. And so we're trying to collect stool samples from a variety of people with a variety of illnesses, because the more data we have, the better. And we're trying to use that. And this is open to kids as well. We're trying to use this information to really fine-tune treatments and to see if we can actually figure out medications that might work for people, or if there's different types of psychobiotic treatments that we can design that might be more appropriate for people. And so we have our biobank is getting stool samples from people at various stages of illness. We've currently set up the biobank to get samples from individuals who have depression, who have anxiety, and who have ADHD. We're hoping to expand within the next couple of weeks to get samples from individuals with autism and OCD as well. And so if you are somebody who has these illnesses and know of somebody who has these illnesses and you want to donate the stool samples to see if that can help us build better treatments, you can feel free to kind of send an email to the biobank is called Orbit. So orbit@ucalgary.ca. And the good thing about both of these is that you don't have to go into the hospital for them. For the biobank, we'll just send you collection kits and you can send them back. You don't ever have to come into the campus at all. For the microbiome fecal transplant study, you do have to come into the university a couple times to get the pills, but you don't actually have to come into the hospital. And most of the follow-ups can be done virtually via Zoom. We're trying to minimize having people come onto campus if they don't want to try to be respectful of kind of everybody's different wishes during these really unusual times. And so ultimately, sorry.
Hey, Dr. Taylor, I just wanted to let everybody know that these studies will be sent out to everyone after the presentation.
Thank you very much. Yes, we're happy to share information about how people can become involved in this. And please feel free to share that on. And I think just in conclusion, this is I thought was a really nice picture of kind of all of the weird science that has sort of helped us get to where we are today, from the animal studies to the bacterial studies that have allowed us to hopefully be involved in kind of the tomorrow outcomes, which are going to be, we hope, really personalized treatments that look at different approaches to our understanding of how some of these mental illnesses may be started and potentially how they can be treated. And I'm going to conclude with, this was a quote from somebody who was leading the National Institute of Mental Health in the US. And basically he wrote this a couple of years ago to kind of show that he really felt that the next big breakthrough in mental health and mental illness treatments were going to be focused on looking at the microbiome and how differences in our microbial world influence the development of brain behavior. And so we're really excited to kind of be part of that here at the University of Calgary. And I hope to be sort of leading the investigation in this area when it comes to work in humans to actually translate some of this really compelling science into much needed new treatments. And so with that, I am happy to kind of take questions from people. I'm going to defer back to my host to figure out how to best do that. And if people want to send questions in the chat that you guys read out, or how you would like to do it.
Yeah, 1 second. So one question just came in. I assume for the study, a candidate is currently not on medication?
No, so actually that's an excellent question. Because these are regulated studies and there currently exist treatments for depression, we're not allowed to do studies in which we take people off approved treatments to investigate a investigational treatment. And so we're looking for people who are currently on an antidepressant but not responding to it. And so ideally we want people who have tried at least one previous treatment before the one they're on now. And so I've given at least 2 antidepressants a try. An exclusion criteria is having been on more than 4 antidepressants, because right now the thinking is if you've tried and failed 4 antidepressants and none of them have worked, perhaps there's something else going on other than simple straightforward depression, and that warrants kind of an assessment from a specialist and maybe some different types of therapies. Now, sometimes people have kind of taken an antidepressant for a week and decided they didn't like it, they couldn't tolerate the side effects. And, if they've taken 3 or 4, but only for a short period of time, that really wouldn't count as actually a full antidepressant trial. And so if you're interested in the study, but you're not sure if you qualify, just send us an email and we'll walk you through the process and review your treatment history with you and look at whether or not this might be a good fit or not.
Right. Florence is asking, looking for guidance on fecal transplant for autism here in Calgary for my 10-year-old nephew. Any guidance you can provide?
I wish. Right now, that is not currently happening. There's the autism study is happening at in the US. That's not helpful for you, and I'm sorry about that. We've been working with the university and with different researchers in the university to try to see if this is something that we can make available. And at the same time, we're trying to get data into our biobank to see if we can create treatments that are actually a bit more specific than fecal transplant for some of these illnesses, which we can then get up and running here. And so that's the goal. But right now, unfortunately, this is not something that we can access currently. We can do depression, but that's it. And of course, there's a number of different medical illnesses for which there are studies, mostly GI. So I believe that there's a inflammatory bowel disease, so Crohn's and colitis study that's happening as well. And so perhaps if somebody happens to have autism and inflammatory bowel disease, then they would qualify for those types of studies.
Jennifer is asking, I'm curious about any connection between this and IBS symptoms.
So that's a great question. And actually in our fecal transplant study, we're looking at whether or not there's a difference in terms of if people with depression versus people with depression plus IBS are more or less likely to respond. We certainly know that there's much higher rates of depression and anxiety in individuals who have IBS as compared to those who don't. And again, one of the suggestions around that is that GI illnesses predispose to psychiatric illnesses, and so we're actually investigating that as part of our work to be able to kind of comment on that a little bit more.
Someone is asking, how can I increase serotonin in my gut?
How can you so we can just, I guess, you can have a healthy microbiome, and that should allow your microbiome to do all of the things that you need it to do. And so right now there's no magic diet, but just an overall balanced diet, looking at some of these superfoods, if you can access them and you like eating them, might be helpful. some of the boring stuff that we're all told, kind of trying to decrease your alcohol intake, increase your exercise, all of those things actually make your GI system happy. Probiotics, if you can't increase your diet to have it be sort of a healthy diet, may be helpful just for helping create a healthy microbiome, and hopefully a healthy microbiome does the things that it's supposed to do. But one of the things is that we don't know. There's a difference, I guess, in being healthy and being ill, and so many people. There's a lot of different. There's no one magic microbiome, and if many of us listening on this call, we all may be healthy, and if somebody did an analysis of our gut microbiome, everybody's may be different. There's not one right way, and there's lots of different ways to be healthy, which is great. And what may happen is that somebody who's ill is just, there's a deviation in, it may be that every single one of us who's healthy, we all look different, but we have some core pieces in common. And it's those core pieces that are missing in individuals whom are unwell. And one of the things that may do is that, in individuals whom are unwell, they may have a gut microbiome that doesn't respond very well to different types of medications. A lot of medications are broken down in your GI system. And so they're not going to break down different medications properly. They're not going to break down different foods properly. And so it may be that if you're kind of feeling okay and you just want to have a healthier GI system, things like diet and exercise and probiotics may make a difference. If you actually have an illness, that's unfortunately not going to be enough, and it may take a more targeted gut microbiome manipulation to change things up, and that's what we're looking at with the fecal transplant.
All right, we have a question from Sharon. How long do you expect it will take to see this science translate into mainstream practice in psychiatry?
I'm hoping sooner than not. So we're going to be publishing the results of our first study, which is going to be closing, which is in Toronto for bipolar depression. Hopefully by the end of this year, the study actually should officially close in 2 weeks. We'll have recruited everybody that we know that we need. We have to do a couple months of follow-up of some of the people who just kind of joined the study this month. But we're hoping that we're going to be able to report on that very soon. And if the results that we saw at the midpoint hold up, I think that it's gonna kind of be a bit of a game changer. And then the quicker we can find recruits to participate in the studies here that we're running at U of C, the quicker we'll be able to finish those, write them up, and I think that again, if things continue to go as we've seen, there's going to be a compelling body of evidence to move this field forward quite quickly, because some of the good things is that these are pretty side effect free treatments as well. So it's not just that they seem to work, but they seem to be really, really side effect free, which is unfortunately not something we see with a lot of other psychiatric medications. And so I think if we can get this data out into the system, it's going to skyrocket, are going to really springboard this field of research quite quickly, and I hope allow us to develop some treatments that get mainstream sooner rather than later.
Wonderful. I've got 2 more questions here and then we'll wrap up. If any of your questions were not addressed, please send them to ces@ahs.ca and we'll forward them on to Dr. Taylor. If low FODMAP and gentle GI diet has been unsuccessful, but the foods listed in the ones you listed with good probiotics are against those diets, it causes concern to try. Would there be a reason why those would help if the diets were a failure to treat severe IBSD?
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, and you know what? Again, some of the things that we're recommending are kind of in individuals who have a healthy GI system. If you have a GI system that's compromised, you're going to have difficulty breaking down some of the high fiber foods and things. And so, again, that's part of why individuals are unwell. And so I am not making any diet recommendations, especially in individuals who have things that are more complex, like diagnosis of IBS or IBD. I would say in those instances, go back and talk to your primary healthcare provider, and they can give you the best advice. And it's basically that your system, if it's to oversimplify things, it's not working properly, and it's not going to be able to break these things down, and so you're not going to be able to benefit from them. But perhaps there are other ways in which you can look at microbiome manipulation, but that's something that you should talk to with your healthcare provider. But fortunately, here at U of C, in the Calgary system, we have a lot of people who are pretty informed about this in the GI world. And so you should be able to find somebody who's going to really be knowledgeable.
And do you have to live in Calgary to participate in the studies?
You do not have to live in Calgary, but you have to be able to get here. It's really hard for me to, at least once a week, I get an email from somebody who's not within the province of Alberta, and sometimes not even within the country of Canada. They're emailing from different locations, and they're desperate, and they really want to be part of this research. And unfortunately, for a myriad of kind of safety and regulatory reasons, they can't. But if you are within kind of driving distance of Calgary, so you can feel like you can get here for the different appointments that are necessary, then absolutely you can participate in the study. So as long as you are based in somewhere in Alberta and you feel you can kind of make it to U of C for the 3 or 4 visits that are required in person to pick up the pills, basically, then absolutely you can participate.
Right, Alex is saying, could you please, please, please make sure that all participants in this webinar get the recording or a link to it afterwards? Yes, Alex, we will be sending that out in the coming days, as well as the posters of the studies. So I want to thank Dr. Taylor again. CES is fortunate to always have great speakers give freely of their time and expertise, and this evening was no exception. I also want to thank all of our attendees, parents, teachers, caregivers, everyone who after a busy day and during back to school time have made the time to learn how to better help youth in their care and themselves. So please register for future CES sessions and share our newsletter. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you so much, everyone.